I'm Danny Morales, a taxi driver in Detroit who survived the first 72 hours of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged the world into volcanic winter, I watched my city freeze to death in July. My 18 years of driving, these streets became the difference between life and death as I rescued strangers and fought desperate survivors. My Crown Vic taxi became a lifeboat in a frozen wasteland where the temperature dropped 40 degrees overnight. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Danny Morales and I've been driving nights in Detroit for 18 years. I thought I'd seen everything this city could throw at me until the morning the world decided to freeze itself to death. When you spend nearly 2 decades behind the wheel of a taxi, cruising through the darkest corners of a city that's already been written off by most of America, you develop certain instincts. You learn to read people in the first 5 seconds they slide into your back seat. You memorize which streets to avoid after midnight and which ones lead to nothing but trouble. You keep emergency supplies in your trunk because in Detroit you never know when a routine fare might turn into a matter of life and death. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for Tuesday morning, July 15th, when every phone in the city started screaming with emergency alerts at exactly 6:43 in the morning. I was parked in my usual spot outside Detroit Medical Center, engine idling, waiting for Martha. Martha Rodriguez had been my regular Tuesday morning fare for 3 years running. Every week, same routine. She'd finish her 12-hour shift in the emergency room, stumble out those glass doors looking like she'd wrestled with death itself, and climb into the back of my Crown Vic for the 20-minute ride to her apartment. On the east side, Martha never talked much during those rides. Most people don't want conversation at 7 in the morning after spending all night putting broken people back together. But she always tipped in cash, never complained about the music, and treated me like a human being instead of just another piece of Detroit's machinery. In my line of work, that kind of respect means everything. So when every phone within earshot started blasting that bone-chilling emergency alert tone, the same sound that usually meant tornadoes or chemical spills, I knew something was seriously wrong. The alerts kept coming, one after another, like some kind of electronic panic attack. I pulled my phone from the cup holder and read the message that would change everything. Massive volcanic eruption at Yellowstone National Park. Ash cloud spreading across western United States. Seek shelter immediately. Avoid breathing outdoor air. My first thought was that this had nothing to do with us. Yellowstone was 2,000 miles away? Volcanic eruptions happened all the time around the world. I'd driven through enough Detroit winters to know that whatever Mother Nature threw at us, we'd survive it. We always did. This city had been declared dead more times than I could count, but it kept breathing, kept fighting, kept finding ways to endure. A little volcanic ash from halfway across the country wasn't going to be the thing that finally killed Detroit. That's when I noticed the ash. At first I thought it was snow. In July. In Detroit. Which should have been impossible, but there it was, drifting down from a sky that looked like someone had smeared charcoal across gray canvas. The flakes weren't white like snow. They were dark, almost black, and when they hit my windshield, they left streaks of grit that my wipers couldn't quite clear away. The temperature gauge on my dashboard, which had read 82 degrees when I'd started my shift 6 hours earlier, now showed 59 degrees and dropping. I'd been listening to my police scanner out of habit, the way most taxi drivers do. You pick up patterns in the chatter, learn to predict where the trouble spots will be, which neighborhoods to steer clear of. But the voices coming through that speaker were different now. Panicked, confused. Dispatch was fielding calls about car accidents caused by sudden ice patches, about people collapsing on sidewalks, about power outages spreading across the city, like some kind of electronic plague. That's when Martha emerged from the hospital. I'd seen Martha tired before. I'd seen her frustrated, angry, heartbroken after losing patients she'd fought to save. But I'd never seen her look terrified. She moved across that parking lot like someone running from a burning building, clutching her purse against her chest, her scrubs wrinkled and stained in ways that told stories I didn't want to hear. When she yanked open the back door of my cab, the look in her eyes made my stomach drop. Martha had always been professional, composed, the kind of person who could handle whatever crisis walked through those emergency room doors. But as she collapsed into the back seat, Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely get her seatbelt fastened. "Take me home, Danny." She said it so quietly I almost didn't hear her over the police scanner. "Drive slow. The streets are already icing over, and I just spent 12 hours watching people die from hypothermia." In July, Danny. In July. I'd driven through Detroit blizzards that buried cars up to their windows. I'd navigated ice storms that turned every street into a skating rink. But hypothermia in July was something my 18 years of experience hadn't prepared me for. Martha went on to explain, her voice barely steady, about the emergency room, filling up with people who'd been caught outside when the temperature plummeted, construction workers who'd passed out on job sites, homeless individuals who'd been found unconscious in doorways where they'd survived countless winter nights, kids who'd been playing in parks when the ash started falling and the air turned, cold enough to burn their lungs. As I pulled away from Detroit Medical Center, I watched the last functional streetlight on Cass Avenue flicker and die, plunging the road into an ash-gray twilight that shouldn't have existed at 7 in the morning, in the middle of summer. The radio was cycling through emergency broadcasts, but none of them made any real sense. Scientists talking about volcanic winter, about ash clouds blocking sunlight, about global temperature drops that could last for months or even years. It all sounded like science fiction, until I saw people huddling around trash can fires on street corners, already learning to survive in a world where summer had become winter overnight. The drive to Martha's apartment usually took 20 minutes through normal Detroit traffic. That morning, it took nearly an hour. Cars were breaking down everywhere. Vehicles that had been running fine in 80-degree weather couldn't handle the sudden temperature drop. Batteries were dying. Engines were seizing up. Radiators were freezing despite the antifreeze that should have protected them. I passed at least a dozen abandoned cars, their owners long gone, probably walking home through weather that could kill them if they weren't careful. My Crown Vic was built different. I'd bought it used from a police auction 7 years earlier, and it had been designed to handle whatever Detroit could dish out. The previous owner had installed heavy-duty battery, reinforced heating system, and winter-grade fluids that stayed liquid well below freezing. I'd always kept emergency supplies. In the trunk, too. Blankets, flashlights, first aid kit, water, energy bars, road flares, jumper cables, tire iron, and a crowbar that had gotten me out of more than one tight spot over the years. Most drivers thought I was paranoid for carrying all that gear year-round. That morning, it started looking like the smartest thing I'd ever done. When we finally reached Martha's building, she hesitated before getting out. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse that had been divided into low-income housing, the kind of place where the heat barely worked in winter and the air conditioning never worked in summer. She looked at that building like it was a tomb. "Danny," she said, still not moving to open the door. The backup generators at the hospital started failing around 4 this morning. The main power grid is going down section by section across the whole city. When I left, they were talking about declaring a state of emergency, but the emergency services can't keep up with the calls. There are too many people who need help, and not enough people who can provide it. She paused, staring out at the ash, falling like snow. "I've been a nurse for 15 years. I've seen people die from hypothermia before, but never in July. Never this fast, and never this many at once." I helped her out of the cab and walked her to the building entrance, making sure she got inside safely. The lobby was already cold enough that I could see my breath, and the elevator wasn't working. As I watched her climb those stairs, I realized that Martha might not survive the next few days in that apartment, without heat, without power, without any way to stay warm in weather that was getting colder by the hour. That should have been the end of my shift. I should have driven home to my own apartment, maybe grabbed some supplies from the store and waited for the government to fix whatever was happening. But as I sat in my idling cab outside Martha's building, listening to the police scanner report emergency after emergency, I made a decision that probably saved my life and definitely changed everything that came after. Instead of going home, I started driving toward the calls. My first pickup was an elderly man named Frank who'd been stranded when his car died outside a pharmacy on 8 Mile Road. Frank was maybe 70 years old, wearing a thin jacket that had been adequate for normal July weather, but was nowhere near enough for what we were dealing with now. He was standing next to his broken-down sedan, trying to flag down. Passing cars, but everyone was too focused on their own survival to stop for a stranger. Frank climbed into my cab gratefully, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely speak. When he finally warmed up enough to talk, he told me he'd been a city engineer for 35 years before retiring. He knew Detroit's infrastructure better than almost anyone alive, and what he had to say made my blood run cold. The power grid wasn't designed for this kind of temperature swing, he explained as we drove toward his house. The sudden cooling was causing massive stress on electrical systems throughout the city. Transformers were failing, power lines were contracting and snapping, backup generators were running out of fuel or breaking down under the increased demand. Within the next day or two, he predicted, most of Detroit would be without electricity. And without electricity, that meant no heat, no lights, no refrigeration, no communication systems, and no way to pump gasoline or water. Frank lived alone in a small house near the Detroit River, but when we got there, his furnace wouldn't start and his phone line was dead. He looked at that dark, cold house the same way Martha had looked at her apartment building, like it was a death sentence. I made another decision that changed everything. Instead of dropping Frank off and driving away, I asked him if he wanted to come with me. I told him I was going to keep driving, keep picking up people who needed help, at least until my gas ran out or my cab broke down. Frank looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. He went into his house, packed a bag with warm clothes and whatever supplies he could carry, and climbed back into my cab. That's how it started. Two strangers and a taxi driver, driving through a city that was freezing to death around us. Our next call came over the police scanner around 9:30 that morning. Two teenagers stranded at a bus stop on Grand River Avenue after the bus broke down, and the driver abandoned them. When we found them, Amy and Connor Williams were huddled, together under a thin bus shelter, trying to share a single hoodie between them. Amy was maybe 16, Connor maybe 14. They'd been on their way to school when everything started falling apart. Their bus driver had simply stopped the bus, announced that his shift was over, and walked away, leaving a dozen passengers to figure out their own transportation. Most of the other passengers had scattered, but Amy and Connor had nowhere to go. Their mother worked double shifts at 2 different jobs and wouldn't be home until evening. Their father wasn't in the picture. They lived in an apartment complex 15 miles away, with no money for cab fare and no way to contact anyone who could help them. They'd been sitting at that bus stop for almost 3 hours, watching the temperature drop and the ash accumulate, waiting for another bus that would never come. Amy was the older of the two, clearly trying to be responsible for her little brother, but I could see hypothermia starting to set in. Her lips were turning blue and she couldn't stop shivering. Connor was in better shape, but he kept looking at his sister with the kind of terror that comes from watching someone you love slowly dying and not knowing how to help them. I made the decision quickly. There was room in my cab for 2 more passengers and these kids needed help immediately. Frank agreed without hesitation. We got Amy and Connor into the back seat, cranked up the heat, and shared our emergency supplies. Within 20 minutes, Amy's color started returning to normal, and Connor stopped looking like he was about to watch his sister die. But that created a new problem. I now had 4 people depending on my cab for survival, and my fuel gauge was showing less than half a tank. In normal circumstances, half a tank would last me most of a day, but running the heater continuously, driving slowly through increasingly dangerous road conditions and making constant stops, was burning gas faster than usual. I estimated we had maybe 6 or 7 hours of driving time left before we'd be stranded just like everyone else. That's when Frank made a suggestion that probably saved all our lives. He remembered reading about the old steam tunnel system that ran beneath downtown Detroit. The tunnels had been built in the early 1900s to carry heated steam from central power plants to buildings throughout the downtown area. Most of the system had been abandoned decades ago, but some sections might still be intact. If we could find access to those tunnels, we might find a place that stayed warm, even without electricity. Frank also mentioned something else. During his years as a city engineer, he'd worked on maintenance projects at some of Detroit's older industrial facilities. Many of them had been built with geothermal heating systems that operated independently of the main power grid. If any of those facilities were still operational, they might provide shelter for more than just the 4 of us. The idea of going underground in the middle of an apocalypse should have terrified me. But as I watched more cars break down around us, as the police scanner reported that emergency services were completely overwhelmed, as the ash continued falling and the temperature continued dropping, I realized that conventional survival strategies weren't going to work. We needed to think differently. We needed to find solutions that other people weren't considering. By noon, it was snowing. In July, in Detroit. Real snow, mixed with the volcanic ash, creating a gray slush that was already accumulating on sidewalks and streets. The temperature had dropped below 40 degrees, and weather reports were predicting it would continue falling throughout the day and night. I'd been driving these streets for 18 years, but I'd never seen Detroit look like this. Empty. Abandoned. Cars scattered everywhere like toys thrown by an angry child. Businesses closed and dark. People moving carefully from building to building, bundled in whatever warm clothes they could find, looking like refugees in their own city. That's when the power grid finally started its complete collapse. It began with streetlights going dark, section by section, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Then traffic signals failed at major intersections, creating chaos as drivers tried to navigate without guidance. Store signs went black. Office buildings became dark towers against an ash-gray sky. Residential neighborhoods disappeared into shadow as power disappeared from entire city blocks. Within 2 hours, most of Detroit was without electricity. The police scanner went quiet around 2 in the afternoon. Either the emergency services had lost power, or they'd simply been overwhelmed by more calls than they could possibly handle. Probably both. The silence from that radio was more frightening than any of the panicked chatter had been. It meant we were truly on our own. Frank suggested we head toward the downtown area, where the old steam tunnels were most likely to still exist. But getting there meant driving through some of Detroit's most dangerous neighborhoods, areas that were rough enough during normal times and would be absolutely lethal now that law enforcement had disappeared and desperate people were starting to realize that normal rules no longer applied. As we made our way slowly through streets that were becoming increasingly treacherous, I started noticing signs of social breakdown, broken windows at convenience stores, groups of people moving purposefully from building to building, clearly looking for supplies to steal, cars that had been stripped of parts by people trying to get their own vehicles running, the kind of opportunistic looting that always happened during disasters, except this time, there were no police coming to restore order. That's when I realized something that changed my entire perspective on our situation. The cold wasn't our biggest enemy. The lack of electricity wasn't our biggest enemy. Other people were going to be our biggest enemy. Desperate, frightened, angry people who would do whatever they thought necessary to survive. People who would see our running taxi, our warm clothes, our supplies, and decide they needed those things more than we did. I started paying attention to my surroundings differently. Not just looking for stranded people who needed help, but also watching for potential threats. Groups that might try to stop us. Areas where we could be trapped or ambushed. Escape routes if we needed to get away. Quickly. Around 4 in the afternoon, we encountered our first real test. We were driving through an area near the old Tiger Stadium when 3 men stepped into the street directly in front of my cab. They weren't asking for help. They weren't trying to flag us down for assistance. They were blocking our path deliberately, and I could see more people moving in the shadows on both sides of the street. I'd been in situations like this before during my years of night driving. Usually it involved drunk people looking for trouble, or someone trying to rob a taxi driver they thought would be an easy target. But this was different. These weren't opportunistic criminals looking for quick cash. These were people who'd realized that normal society had collapsed, and they were adapting to the new rules faster than most. One of the men approached my driver's side window. He was maybe 30 years old, wearing layers of clothing that suggested he'd been living rough even before the apocalypse started. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost polite, which made him more dangerous than if he'd been screaming threats. "Nice cab," he said. "Looks like it's running real good. We've got some people who need rides to warmer places. Why don't you step out and we'll discuss how this is going to work?" I could see the others moving closer, could see that they'd positioned, themselves to prevent us from backing up or driving around them. Could see that this wasn't a request or a negotiation. They intended to take my taxi, and they probably intended to leave us stranded in the cold. That's when 18 years of driving Detroit's night shift became the difference between life and death. I'd learned to read situations like this, to assess threats quickly, to make split-second decisions about when to cooperate and when to fight. More importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the best defense is doing something unexpected. Instead of stopping or trying to negotiate, I hit the gas. My Crown Vic had enough weight and power to push through obstacles that would stop smaller cars. The man at my window jumped aside as I accelerated past him. The other two scattered as I drove directly between them. I heard someone shout behind us, probably cursing, but by then we were already moving too fast for them to catch up. Martha's medical training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but I could hear Amy crying softly in the back seat, and Connor was asking questions I couldn't answer about what would have happened if those men had taken our cab. The truth was, I knew exactly what would have happened. We would have been stranded in freezing weather with no transportation, no supplies, and no realistic way to find shelter before hypothermia killed us. Those men weren't evil. They were just scared people trying to survive. But in a situation where resources were limited and survival was uncertain, scared people could become more dangerous than any natural disaster. That encounter changed our dynamic completely. We stopped being four strangers sharing a cab ride and became a survival group that needed to work together to stay alive. Frank started using his engineering knowledge to suggest routes that would keep us away from areas where we might be trapped. Amy and Connor began watching out the rear window for people who might be following us. And I started thinking like someone who was being hunted instead of someone who was just trying to help. As evening approached and the temperature continued dropping, we faced another crisis. My fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, and most gas stations were either without power or had been abandoned by their staff. The few stations that still had electricity had lines of cars wrapped around entire city blocks, and many of those lines had devolved into arguments and fights as people realized there might not be enough gas for everyone. We couldn't afford to sit in those lines. We couldn't afford to get trapped in conflicts with other desperate people. And we couldn't afford to run out of gas in the middle of a city that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. Frank suggested we look for abandoned vehicles that might still have fuel in their tanks. It felt like theft, but those cars had been sitting empty for hours, and their owners were either dead or had already found other transportation. We found a few cars that still had some gas, and Frank showed Connor how to siphon fuel using a length of tubing from my emergency kit. It wasn't much, maybe enough for another few hours of driving, but it bought us time to think, to plan, to figure out what we were going to do when the sun went down and the temperature dropped even further. That's when Martha made a suggestion that terrified me. She thought we should go back to the hospital. Detroit Medical Center had backup generators, emergency supplies, and trained medical staff who might be able to help Amy, who was still showing signs of mild hypothermia despite the warmth of the cab. The hospital would be warm, safe, and staffed, with people who knew how to handle medical emergencies. But I knew something Martha didn't know. Hospitals during disasters become magnets for desperate people. Everyone who was injured, sick, or simply looking for a warm place to wait out the crisis would be heading there. The hospital would be overcrowded, overwhelmed, and probably running short on supplies. Worse, it would be filled with people who were scared, angry, and potentially violent. Frank agreed with me. His experience with city emergency planning had taught him that centralized shelters often became more dangerous than the disasters they were supposed to protect people from. Too many frightened people in too small a space, competing for limited resources, was a recipe for violence. We needed a different solution, somewhere warm, somewhere defensible, somewhere that other people weren't likely to think of or be able to access easily. That's when Frank remembered something from his engineering days that would change everything. He'd worked on a maintenance project at an old industrial heating plant near the Detroit River. The facility had been built in the 1920s to provide steam heat for several city blocks, and it operated on geothermal energy that didn't depend on the electrical grid. The plant had been partially shut down in the 1980s, but some of its systems might still be operational. More importantly, the plant was connected to the old steam tunnel system that ran beneath downtown Detroit. If we could find access to those tunnels, we might be able to reach the heating plant without traveling through the increasingly dangerous streets above ground. It was a desperate plan. Going underground during an apocalypse meant risking cave-ins, flooding, getting lost in tunnels that hadn't been maintained for decades, and potentially encountering other people who'd had the same idea. But as darkness fell and the temperature dropped below freezing, staying above ground was looking like a death sentence. Around 6 that evening, we found what we were looking for: a maintenance entrance to the steam tunnel system, hidden behind an abandoned building near downtown Detroit. The metal door was locked, but my crowbar made short work of that problem. Frank had a flashlight and I had emergency flares that would provide light for several hours. The tunnel entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for one person at a time, and the air inside smelled like rust, mold, and decades of abandonment. But it was noticeably warmer than the outside air, which suggested that some part of the steam system might still be carrying heat. We made the decision to leave my cab hidden behind the abandoned building and enter the tunnels on foot. It meant abandoning our transportation, our mobile shelter, and our primary means of escape if something went wrong. But it also meant we might find a permanent shelter that could keep us alive for days or weeks instead of just hours. As we prepared to descend into those dark tunnels, carrying whatever supplies we could manage on foot, I realized that we'd crossed a line. We were no longer just trying to survive the first day of an apocalypse. We were making long-term decisions about how to live in a world that had fundamentally changed forever. Frank led the way with his flashlight, using his knowledge of Detroit's underground infrastructure to navigate tunnels that hadn't seen human visitors in years. Amy and Connor stayed close together, helping each other carry supplies and trying not to think about how many tons of earth and concrete were above our heads. I brought up the rear, carrying the heaviest equipment and listening for sounds that might indicate we weren't alone down there. The tunnels were larger than I'd expected, clearly designed for maintenance workers to move easily through the system when it was operational. The walls were lined with massive pipes, some still warm to the touch, which confirmed Frank's theory that parts of the steam system were still carrying heat. But the tunnels were also darker than anything I'd experienced, the kind of absolute blackness that made you feel like you'd gone blind. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we heard the first sound that didn't come from our own footsteps: voices, echoing from somewhere ahead of us in the darkness. Other people who'd had the same idea we'd had. Frank stopped immediately, and we all listened. The voices were too far away to make out words, but they were definitely human. Definitely. Multiple people. And definitely coming from the direction we needed to go to reach the heating plant. That's when I realized our journey underground was about to become much more complicated than we'd anticipated, and that first crisis was nothing compared to what happened when the sun went down. We stood in that tunnel for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to those voices echoing through the darkness ahead of us. Frank kept his flashlight pointed at the ground so the beam wouldn't give away our position, and we communicated in whispers that were barely audible, even to each other. The voices seemed to be getting closer, but in those tunnels sound bounced off walls and pipes in ways that made it impossible to judge distance or direction accurately. Amy was gripping Connor's hand so tightly I could see her knuckles even, in the dim light from Frank's flashlight. Connor was trying to be brave for his sister, but I could tell he was scared. These kids had been through enough trauma in the past 12 hours to last most people a lifetime. And now we were asking them to navigate underground tunnels that might be occupied by hostile strangers. Frank was using his engineering knowledge to study the tunnel layout, trying to determine if there were alternate routes to the heating plant. The steam system had been designed with multiple pathways for maintenance access, but many of those routes might be blocked, flooded, or collapsed. After decades of neglect, our options were limited and every choice carried risks we couldn't fully assess. I made the decision to move forward cautiously. We needed to know who else was down there, what their intentions were, and whether they represented a threat or an opportunity. My 18 years of driving Detroit's night shift had taught me that most people, even in desperate situations, were more interested in their own survival than in harming strangers. But it had also taught me that fear could turn ordinary people into dangerous ones very quickly. We moved slowly through the tunnel, Frank leading with his flashlight beam directed downward, staying close to the wall where the shadows were deepest. The voices became clearer as we got closer, and I began to make out individual words. They were talking about warmth, about food, about finding supplies. The same concerns that occupied our own thoughts. That was encouraging. People planning. Violence usually talked about weapons, about taking things from others, about who they were going to target next. When we finally got close enough to see them, we discovered a group of 6 people gathered around what appeared to be a functioning steam pipe. They'd set up a makeshift camp in a wider section of the tunnel, using cardboard and blankets to create windbreaks around the warm pipe. They had flashlights, sleeping bags, and enough supplies to suggest they'd been planning this underground refuge for several hours. The group consisted of 2 families, an older couple maybe in their 60s with an adult daughter and her teenage son, a younger couple with a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. They were sharing food, taking turns warming, their hands against the steam pipe and discussing their plans for the next day. They looked tired, scared, and cold, but they also looked organized and cooperative. Frank and I exchanged glances. These people might be willing to share information about the tunnel system, about the heating plant, about other groups they might have encountered. They might also be willing to work together, rather than compete for resources. But approaching them carried risks. We didn't know how they'd react to strangers appearing out of the darkness. We didn't know if they'd see us as potential allies or potential threats. I decided to make contact. I called out softly, identifying myself as a taxi driver who'd been helping people find shelter. I explained that we had injured people who needed warmth and medical attention, and that we were looking for a safe place to wait out the crisis. My voice echoed strangely in the tunnel, but it carried the right tone, non-threatening, seeking help rather than offering threats. The response was cautious but not hostile. The older man, who seemed to be the informal leader of their group, asked us to step into the light where they could see us clearly. He wanted to know how many people we had, whether we were armed, and what our intentions were. Reasonable questions from someone trying to protect his family in an uncertain situation. When we emerged from the shadows, I could see immediate relief on their faces. Frank looked like somebody's grandfather. Amy and Connor were obviously teenagers who needed help, rather than people who could threaten anyone. I was clearly a working-class guy who'd been caught in the same disaster as everyone else. We didn't look like raiders or criminals. We looked like survivors. The older man introduced himself as Robert Chen, a retired teacher who'd been living in downtown Detroit with his wife Linda when the crisis started. Their daughter Sarah worked as a social worker, and her son Marcus was 15 years old. The younger couple were David and Jennifer Martinez with their infant daughter Emma. They'd all ended up in the tunnels through different routes, but they'd found each other and decided to work together. Robert had some knowledge of the tunnel system from his years of teaching Detroit history. He'd brought his students on field trips to learn about the city's industrial past, including the old steam heating network. He knew that the tunnels connected to several different facilities, including the heating plant Frank had mentioned. But he also knew that some sections of the tunnel system had been sealed off or had collapsed over the years. Sarah had social work experience that made her valuable for managing group dynamics and resolving conflicts. She'd already established a system for sharing resources fairly and making decisions collectively. David had mechanical skills from his job at an auto parts store, and he'd been able to jury-rig some improvements to their makeshift shelter. Jennifer was focused entirely on keeping baby Emma warm and fed, which was becoming increasingly difficult as the temperature continued to drop. Infant formula required clean water and proper mixing, and Emma's diapers and clothing needed to be changed regularly. Taking care of a baby in these conditions was nearly impossible, but Jennifer was managing through sheer determination and the help of the other group members. Marcus had been taking inventory of their supplies and estimating how long they could survive in the tunnel. His calculations were not encouraging. They had food for maybe 3 days, water for 2 days, and battery power for their flashlights for perhaps 6 hours. The steam pipe provided warmth, but they needed more substantial shelter if they were going to survive for more than a few days. When I told them about Frank's knowledge of the heating plant, Robert's eyes lit up with hope. He'd heard about the geothermal facility during his research into Detroit's industrial history, but he'd never known its exact location or whether it was still operational. If Frank could guide us there, and if the plant was still producing heat, we might have found a long-term solution to our survival problems. But getting there would require traveling through sections of the tunnel system that none of us had explored. We'd be moving through unfamiliar territory, possibly encountering other groups of survivors, definitely risking getting lost or trapped if we made wrong turns. The journey would take several hours, and we'd have to carry all our supplies on foot through narrow tunnels that might be partially flooded or blocked. Frank studied the tunnel layout using his flashlight and his knowledge of Detroit's underground infrastructure. He identified 3 possible routes to the heating plant, each with different advantages and risks. The most direct route was also the most likely to be occupied by other people. The safest route was also the longest and most difficult to navigate. The middle option balanced distance against risk, but it required passing through a section of tunnel that Frank remembered as being prone to flooding. While Frank was planning our route, I was thinking about group dynamics. We now had 10 people instead of 4, including an elderly couple, a baby, and 2 teenagers. Moving that many people through dangerous territory would be slow, noisy, and complicated. We'd need to coordinate our movements carefully, establish signals for communication, and have contingency plans for what to do if we encountered hostile groups or impassable obstacles. Sarah suggested we combine our resources and travel together. More people meant more skills, more supplies, and more capability to deal with whatever challenges we might face. But it also meant more mouths to feed, more people to keep warm, and more potential for conflicts or disagreements about strategy. Robert was concerned about the risks of underground travel with such a large group. He'd heard stories about other tunnel systems in major cities, about people getting lost for days or weeks, about groups that had entered tunnels and never been seen again. The Detroit steam tunnel system was old, poorly maintained, and largely unmapped. Even with Frank's knowledge, we could easily take a wrong turn and end up in sections that led nowhere or that had been sealed off decades ago. David worried about the mechanical challenges of the journey. Many of us were already showing signs of exhaustion from the stress and physical demands of the past 15 hours. Carrying heavy supplies through narrow tunnels for several hours would push everyone to their limits. If someone got injured or simply couldn't continue, we'd face difficult decisions about whether to leave them behind or risk the entire group's survival. Jennifer was focused on Emma's needs. The baby required regular feeding, diaper changes, and temperature control that would be difficult to maintain during an underground journey. Emma was also likely to cry, which could attract unwanted attention from other groups or mask important sounds that might warn us of dangers ahead. Marcus had a different perspective. As the youngest member of our group, he was also the most adaptable to rapidly changing circumstances. He pointed out that staying in our current location wasn't really an option. We didn't have enough supplies to wait for rescue, and the tunnel we were in didn't provide adequate shelter for long-term survival. Moving toward the heating plant was risky, but not moving was guaranteed failure. I found myself thinking about leadership and decision-making in crisis situations. During my years of night driving, I'd learned that in dangerous situations, someone needs to make decisions quickly and stick with them. Group decision-making works fine when you have time to discuss options and build consensus. But in survival situations, too much discussion can lead to paralysis, and paralysis can lead to death. The decision was made for us around 8:30 that evening when we heard new voices echoing from the direction we'd originally come from. Multiple people moving through the tunnel system, clearly searching for something or someone. The voices were louder and more aggressive than the conversation we'd been having, and they were getting closer. Robert immediately began organizing our group to move deeper into the tunnel system. Sarah helped Jennifer pack Emma's supplies while David and Marcus gathered the camping equipment. Linda, who'd been quiet during most of our discussions, revealed that she'd been a nurse before retiring and had brought medical supplies that could be crucial if anyone got injured during our journey. Frank took point position with his flashlight, using his knowledge of the tunnel layout to guide us toward the heating plant, while avoiding the areas where the new voices seemed to be coming from. I brought up the rear, listening for sounds of pursuit and watching for signs that we were being followed. The next section of tunnel was narrower and more difficult to navigate. We had to move single file, with each person staying close enough to the person in front of them to avoid getting separated, but far enough apart to avoid bumping into each other in the darkness. Frank directed his flashlight beam downward to avoid creating visible light that might give away our position, but that made it difficult to see obstacles or hazards in our path. Amy and Connor were handling the underground travel better than I'd expected. These kids had been through trauma that would have broken many adults, but they were adapting to each new challenge with resilience that impressed me. Amy was helping Linda navigate the more difficult sections of tunnel, while Connor was assisting Jennifer with carrying Emma's supplies. The tunnel began to slope downward, and Frank warned us that we were approaching a section that might be partially flooded. Detroit's underground infrastructure had been built more than a century ago, and much of it had been abandoned or poorly maintained for decades. Water infiltration was a constant problem in underground spaces, especially during periods of heavy precipitation or rapid temperature changes. When we reached the flooded section, we discovered that the water was ankle deep but still flowing, which meant it was coming from somewhere and going somewhere else. Frank determined that the water was probably runoff from the temperature changes, above ground, mixed with condensation from the steam pipes. Not pleasant to walk through, but not immediately dangerous. We formed a human chain to help everyone navigate the flooded section safely. Robert and David went first, testing the depth of the water and identifying the safest path. Sarah and Marcus followed, carrying the lighter supplies. Jennifer came next, with Linda and Amy helping her keep Emma dry and warm. Frank and I brought up the rear, making sure no one was left behind and watching for any signs of structural problems that might indicate the tunnel was becoming unsafe. The water was cold enough to numb our feet within minutes, and walking through it was exhausting. The tunnel floor was slippery with decades of accumulated debris, and the flowing water made it difficult to maintain balance while carrying supplies. By the time we reached the far end of the flooded section, everyone was cold, wet, and tired. But we were also making progress toward the heating plant, and Frank's navigation was proving accurate. We were following the correct route, and the tunnels were leading us in the right direction. More importantly, we hadn't encountered any hostile groups, and the voices we'd heard earlier seemed to be fading behind us. Around 10 that evening, we reached a junction where multiple tunnels intersected. Frank studied the layout carefully, using his flashlight to examine markings on the walls and pipes that would indicate which direction led toward the heating plant. The markings were old and partially obscured by rust and grime, but they were still readable to someone who understood the system. While Frank was determining our route, Sarah was managing group morale and logistics. She organized a brief rest, stop where everyone could sit down, share food and water, and assess how they were handling the journey. It was important to maintain group cohesion and make sure no one was falling behind or developing problems that could compromise our progress. David used the rest stop to examine our equipment and supplies. Several flashlights were showing signs of battery depletion, and we needed to conserve power for the remainder of the journey. He also checked everyone's clothing and footwear, looking for signs of wear or damage that might become problems in the hours ahead. Jennifer took advantage of the stop to feed Emma and change her diaper, using supplies that Linda had organized for maximum efficiency. Caring for an infant under these conditions was incredibly challenging, but Emma was handling the stress better than any of us had hoped. She was staying warm, eating regularly, and sleeping through much of the commotion. Marcus had been monitoring our progress and estimating how much further we needed to travel to reach the heating plant. Based on Frank's navigation and the distance we'd already covered, he calculated that we were probably about halfway to our destination. That was encouraging, but it also meant we still had several hours of underground travel ahead of us. Linda was using her nursing experience to monitor everyone's physical condition. She was particularly concerned about signs of hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion that could compromise our ability to complete the journey. Several people were showing early signs of fatigue, but no one was in immediate danger. Robert was thinking about longer-term strategy. Even if we successfully reached the heating plant, we'd need to establish a sustainable living situation that could support 10 people for an extended period. That meant finding or creating adequate shelter, organizing a system for sharing resources, and establishing security measures to protect against other groups who might want to take our warm sanctuary. As we prepared to resume our journey, Frank made an observation that changed our entire perspective on the situation. The steam pipes we'd been following were carrying more heat than he'd expected. The volume and temperature of the steam suggested that the heating plant was not only still operational, but was actually running at higher capacity than it had during normal operations. That could mean several things. It might indicate that the geothermal systems were functioning correctly and producing adequate heat for the facility. It might mean that someone was already at the plant and had increased its output. Or it might mean that the automatic systems were responding to the cold weather by producing more heat than usual. If the plant was occupied, we needed to know by whom and whether they'd be hostile to our group. If it was running automatically, we needed to understand how to operate its systems safely. If it was producing excess heat, we might be able to support more people than we'd originally planned. The next section of tunnel was the most challenging we'd encountered. It was narrower, with lower ceiling height, and it contained more obstacles, in the form of pipes, valves, and mechanical equipment that we had to navigate around. The tunnel also showed more signs of age and deterioration. We encountered several places where water was dripping from the ceiling, and Frank pointed out cracks in the walls that suggested structural problems. Moving through this section required careful coordination and communication. Frank had to illuminate obstacles with his flashlight while also navigating the route. Each person had to warn the person behind them about hazards they encountered. We had to move slowly enough to avoid accidents, but quickly enough to reach our destination before our supplies ran out. About halfway through the difficult section, we encountered our first major obstacle. A section of the tunnel had partially collapsed, creating a pile of rubble that blocked most of the passage. There was still space to get through, but it required crawling on hands and knees through a gap that was barely large enough for one person at a time. David went through first, testing the stability of the rubble and determining the safest way to navigate the obstacle. He then helped each person through individually, passing supplies separately to avoid having people get stuck while carrying bulky items. The process was slow, exhausting, and nerve-wracking, but everyone made it through safely. Jennifer was particularly concerned about getting Emma through the collapsed section. The gap was narrow enough that she couldn't carry the baby while crawling through, so she had to pass Emma to David on the other side while she navigated the obstacle herself. For several terrifying minutes, Emma was separated from her mother in an underground tunnel, dependent on strangers to keep her safe. On the far side of the collapse, we discovered that the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that appeared to be some kind of maintenance facility. The space was larger than any we'd encountered, with higher ceilings and more room to move around. More importantly, it was noticeably warmer than the tunnels we'd been traveling through. Frank examined the chamber with his flashlight and determined that we were very close to the heating plant. The mechanical equipment in the chamber was connected to the main steam distribution system, and the heat we were feeling was coming from the primary geothermal facility. We were probably less than a quarter-mile from our destination, but we were also exhausted. The underground journey had taken more out of all of us than we'd anticipated. Everyone was showing signs of fatigue, and several people were developing problems that could become serious if we didn't address them soon. Amy was beginning to show signs of hypothermia again, despite the warmer air in the chamber. Robert was having difficulty with his breathing, possibly from the exertion or from air quality issues in the tunnels. Marcus had cut his hand on sharp metal while navigating the collapsed section, and the wound needed attention. Sarah made the decision to establish a rest area in the chamber, while Frank scouted ahead to determine the final approach to the heating plant. We needed to know what we were walking into before we committed our entire group to the last phase of the journey. If the plant was occupied by hostile people, we needed to know that before we put everyone at risk. David and Linda organized medical attention for the people who needed it. Linda cleaned and bandaged Marcus's hand using supplies from her medical kit. David helped Robert with breathing exercises that seemed to ease his respiratory distress. Sarah and Jennifer worked together to get Amy warmed up and to assess her condition for signs of serious hypothermia, while the others were resting and receiving medical attention, I was thinking about what we'd learned during our underground journey. The tunnel system was more extensive and more usable than any of us had expected. Other groups of survivors were using the tunnels, which meant they were a viable option for people trying to escape the surface conditions. The heating plant was operational and producing significant amounts of heat, which suggested we'd found a genuine solution to our survival problems. But we'd also discovered that underground travel was dangerous, exhausting, and time-consuming. The tunnel system was old, poorly maintained, and full of hazards that could trap or injure people who weren't careful. Moving large groups through the tunnels was particularly challenging and required careful planning and coordination. Frank returned from his scouting mission with mixed news. The heating plant was operational and appeared to be unoccupied. The facility was producing substantial amounts of heat and had adequate space to shelter our group. But the final approach to the plant required navigating a section of tunnel that showed signs of recent activity by other people. Someone else had been using the same route we were taking, probably within the past few hours. Frank had found footprints, discarded food, wrappers, and other evidence of human passage. That could mean other survivors had already discovered the heating plant and were either inside the facility or in the area around it. It could also mean that groups were moving through the tunnel system regularly, which increased the chances of encounters with people who might be hostile. The decision facing us was whether to proceed to the heating plant despite the risk of encountering other groups, or to establish a defensive position in the chamber and wait to see what developed. Staying where we were provided some safety and warmth, but it didn't solve our long-term survival problems. We still didn't have adequate food, water, or shelter for extended survival. Moving forward to the heating plant offered the possibility of genuine long-term shelter, but it also meant potentially confronting other groups who might see us as competitors for resources. With 10 people in our group, including elderly individuals, teenagers, and an infant, we weren't well equipped for conflict with hostile survivors. As we debated our options, we began to hear sounds from the tunnels around us. Voices, footsteps, and other noises that suggested multiple groups were moving through the underground system. The tunnels were becoming crowded with survivors, and the likelihood of encounters was increasing rapidly. Sarah pointed out that waiting was probably not an option. If multiple groups were converging on the same area, staying in the chamber would eventually result in confrontation anyway. Moving forward to the heating plant at least gave us the possibility of reaching defensible shelter before we had to deal with other people. Robert agreed, but he was concerned about the tactical situation. If we encountered hostile groups between our current position and the heating plant, we'd be trapped in narrow tunnels with limited options for escape or defense. If we reached the plant but found it occupied by unfriendly people, we'd be in an even worse position. David suggested that we needed to change our approach. Instead of moving as one large group, we should split into smaller units that could move more quietly and quickly through the remaining tunnels. If one group encountered problems, the others might be able to avoid the same difficulties or provide assistance. Jennifer was opposed to splitting up the group. Emma needed the security and support that came from having multiple adults available to help with her care. Separating the group also meant that if something went wrong, families could be permanently separated with no way to find each other again. Frank proposed a compromise. He would scout ahead to the heating plant with 1 or 2 other people, determine the situation there, and then return to guide the rest of the group. If the plant was safe and unoccupied, we could move everyone there quickly. If it was occupied or unsafe, we could develop alternative plans without putting everyone at risk. The debate was interrupted by the sound of voices, getting much closer to our chamber. Multiple people were moving through the tunnels nearby, and they were talking loudly enough that we could make out some of their words. They were discussing the same things we were discussing: warmth, food, shelter, and the heating plant that Frank had been guiding us toward. That's when we realized we weren't the only group that knew about the geothermal facility. Other survivors had the same information, the same plan, and the same destination we were heading toward. The question was whether we'd be able to share the facility peacefully, or whether we were walking into a situation that would require us to fight for our survival against other people who were just as desperate as we were. The voices were getting closer, and we could hear multiple conversations happening simultaneously. It sounded like a large group, probably larger than ours, and they were moving with purpose and confidence that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. In a few minutes, they'd reach the chamber where we were resting, and we'd have to decide very quickly whether to hide, flee, or attempt to make contact. But that first crisis was nothing compared to what happened when the sun went down, and we discovered that the heating plant we'd been trying to reach was already occupied by people who had no intention of sharing their warm sanctuary with strangers. The voices in the tunnel were getting closer, and we had maybe 2 minutes to decide what we were going to do. Frank quickly extinguished his flashlight, plunging our chamber into complete darkness. Sarah gathered everyone into a tight group, against the far wall, where the shadows were deepest and we'd be hardest to spot if someone entered the chamber. Jennifer held Emma close, gently covering the baby's mouth to prevent any sounds that might give away our position. I positioned myself near the entrance to the chamber, where I could see anyone approaching and potentially intercept them before they discovered our entire group. My 18 years of night driving had taught me how to assess threats quickly, and I was hoping these approaching voices belonged to people who were more interested in survival than in conflict. The first person to enter our chamber was a woman in her 30s, carrying a powerful flashlight that swept the space systematically. She was followed by 2 men, both carrying backpacks and what appeared to be improvised weapons. Behind them came more people, until I counted 8 individuals total. They moved with the kind of coordination that suggested they'd been working together for a while, and they showed no hesitation about exploring unfamiliar spaces. The woman with the flashlight spotted us almost immediately. Instead of shouting or raising her weapon, she called out in a calm, controlled voice. She identified herself as Dr. Patricia Williams from Detroit Medical Center, and she explained that her group consisted of hospital staff and patients who'd been evacuated when the main power grid failed and the backup generators ran out of fuel. Patricia's group included 2 other doctors, 3 nurses, a hospital security guard, and an elderly patient who'd been in stable condition when they left the hospital but needed ongoing medical supervision. They'd heard about the heating plant from a maintenance worker who'd helped them escape through the hospital's basement connection to the tunnel system. This was both good news and concerning news. Good because medical professionals would be valuable allies in our survival situation. Concerning because if hospital staff knew about the heating plant, that information was probably spreading to other groups throughout the city. We might be walking into a situation where dozens of different survivor groups were converging on the same location. Patricia approached our group carefully, keeping her flashlight pointed downward to avoid blinding anyone. She could see that we had elderly people, teenagers, and an infant, which immediately identified us as a family group, rather than a potential threat. Her medical training also allowed her to assess our physical condition quickly, and she could tell that several of us were showing signs of hypothermia, exhaustion, and minor injuries. Frank stepped forward to represent our group, explaining our situation and our plan to reach the heating plant. Patricia listened carefully, then shared information that changed our entire perspective on what we were walking into. Her group had been in radio contact with other survivor groups throughout the city, and they'd learned that the heating plant was already occupied. A group of approximately 15 people had reached the facility several hours earlier and had established defensive positions around the entrances. They were turning away other survivors, claiming that the plant didn't have capacity to support additional people. Patricia's group had been planning to approach the facility and attempt to negotiate for admission, but they were concerned about the possibility of conflict. The group occupying the heating plant consisted primarily of city employees who'd had advanced knowledge of the facility's capabilities. They included power company workers, city engineers, and municipal emergency management staff who'd coordinated their response to the crisis. They had supplies, equipment, and expertise that made them formidable opponents if negotiations failed. Sarah immediately recognized the problem we were facing. We had 18 people between our 2 groups, including elderly individuals, children, and medical patients who couldn't survive much longer in the cold tunnel conditions. The heating plant represented our best chance for long-term survival, but accessing it would require either successful negotiation with people who'd already demonstrated their unwillingness to share, or some kind of confrontation that none of us were equipped to handle. Patricia suggested that we combine our groups and approach the heating plant together. 18 people would be harder to turn away than either of our groups individually, and the medical expertise her team could provide might be valuable enough to convince the occupying group to allow us entry. She also pointed out that her group had radio equipment that might be useful for communication with other survivor groups. Robert was concerned about the risks of approaching an occupied facility with such a large group. If negotiations failed and conflict developed, we'd have elderly people and children in the middle of a dangerous situation. He suggested that we send a small delegation to attempt negotiations while the rest of us remained hidden in the tunnel system. David agreed with Robert's caution, but he pointed out that staying in the tunnels wasn't a sustainable option. We were already running low on food and water, and several people needed medical attention that couldn't be provided in the underground environment. We needed to reach a warm, secure location soon, or people were going to start dying from exposure and medical complications. Linda was using her nursing experience to assess the condition of Patricia's elderly patient, a man in his 70s who'd been hospitalized for pneumonia when the crisis began. His condition was stable but could deteriorate quickly if he didn't receive proper care in a warm environment. He represented the most urgent medical case in our combined group. Marcus had been listening to the radio equipment that Patricia's group carried, and he'd picked up communications from other survivor groups throughout the city. The radio chatter painted a picture of widespread infrastructure failure, social breakdown, and desperation that was getting worse by the hour. Multiple groups were moving through the tunnel system, seeking the same warm shelters we were looking for. Jennifer was focused on Emma's immediate needs, but she was also thinking about longer-term survival for her infant daughter. Formula supplies were running low, and preparing bottles required clean water and proper sanitation that were difficult to maintain in tunnel conditions. Emma needed a stable, warm environment where Jennifer could establish proper feeding and hygiene routines. Amy and Connor were handling the stress better than most adults would, but they were also reaching their limits. These teenagers had been through trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives, assuming they survived the next few days. They needed stability, safety, and the kind of normal routine that only a permanent shelter could provide. Frankie was studying the tunnel layout and considering alternative approaches to the heating plant. His engineering knowledge suggested that there might be multiple entrances to the facility, including maintenance access points that the occupying group might not be defending. If we could find an unguarded entrance, we might be able to establish a presence in the facility before the current occupants could stop us. The discussion was interrupted by radio chatter that changed everything. Patricia's equipment picked up a transmission from the group occupying the heating plant, and their conversation revealed information that neither of our groups had been expecting. They were planning to leave the facility within the next few hours. The transmission indicated that the heating plant was only a temporary stop for them. They had knowledge of a larger, more secure facility outside the city that could provide better long-term shelter for their group. They were using the heating plant to rest, resupply, and plan their next move, but they weren't planning to stay there permanently. This revelation completely changed our tactical situation. Instead of trying to negotiate with an established group that intended to defend the facility indefinitely, we were looking at a timing problem. If we could wait for them to leave, we might be able to occupy the heating plant without any conflict at all. But we also had to consider the possibility that other survivor groups were monitoring the same radio frequencies and might have the same plan. Patricia suggested that we position ourselves near the heating plant and wait for the current occupants to leave, then move in quickly to establish our own presence before other groups could claim the facility. It was a reasonable strategy, but it required coordinating the movements of 18 people through unfamiliar territory, while maintaining concealment from multiple other groups. Frank identified a position about 200 yards from the heating plant where we could observe the facility without being detected. The location provided cover, multiple escape routes, and access to the tunnel system if we needed to retreat quickly. But getting there would require moving our entire group through the most dangerous section of the underground network. Sarah organized our combined group for the approach to the observation position. She established a movement order that placed the most vulnerable people in the center of the group, with the strongest and most capable individuals at the front and rear. She also created a communication system using hand signals that would allow us to coordinate our movements without making noise that might attract attention. David and the hospital security guard, a man named Officer James Thompson, took point positions for the movement. They had the most experience with potentially dangerous situations, and they could assess threats quickly if we encountered other groups. Thompson also carried one of the few actual weapons in our combined group, a service pistol that he'd retained when the hospital was evacuated. Linda and one of Patricia's nurses, a woman named Catherine Mills, were responsible for managing the medical needs of our group during the movement. They carried medical supplies and were prepared to provide emergency treatment if anyone was injured during the approach to the observation position. The movement through the tunnel system was the most dangerous thing we'd attempted since entering the underground network. We were traveling through areas that showed clear signs of recent activity by other groups, and we could hear voices and movement from multiple directions. The tunnel acoustics made it impossible to determine how many people were nearby or whether they represented threats. About halfway to our destination, we encountered our first serious obstacle. A section of tunnel had been deliberately barricaded by another group, creating a choke point that forced anyone passing through to expose themselves to observation and potential attack. The barricade consisted of debris, furniture, and metal, barriers that completely blocked the tunnel except for a narrow gap barely wide enough for one person. Frank examined the barricade carefully and determined that it had been constructed recently, probably within the past few hours. The materials used suggested that the builders had access to the surface and had brought items down from abandoned buildings or vehicles. More concerning, the construction showed planning and coordination that indicated an organized group with leadership and clear objectives. Thompson scouted ahead through the gap in the barricade and reported that the tunnel beyond appeared to be clear, but he'd found evidence of recent occupation. Someone had established a temporary camp in the area beyond the barricade, complete with sleeping areas, food storage, and what appeared to be a communications station. The camp was currently unoccupied, but it showed signs of regular use. The people who'd built the barricade were probably planning to return, and they'd chosen this location specifically because it allowed them to control access through this section of the tunnel system. Anyone trying to reach the heating plant from our direction would have to pass through their checkpoint. Patricia studied the evidence and concluded that we were looking at an organized group that was using the tunnel system for long-term survival, rather than just temporary shelter. They'd invested time and effort in establishing infrastructure, which suggested they had supplies, leadership, and plans that extended beyond the immediate crisis. Sarah was concerned about the implications for our own survival strategy. If organized groups were establishing permanent presences in the tunnel system, the underground network might not provide the safety and isolation we'd been counting on. We might find ourselves competing with multiple groups for access to warm spaces, supply routes, and defensible positions. Robert pointed out that the existence of organized groups in the tunnels also represented an opportunity. If we could establish peaceful contact with them, we might be able to trade information, coordinate resource sharing, or even form alliances that would improve everyone's chances of survival. David was more skeptical about the possibility of cooperation. His experience with Detroit street dynamics had taught him that desperate people often saw cooperation as weakness and negotiation as an opportunity for exploitation. He was concerned that approaching other groups would expose our vulnerabilities without providing corresponding benefits. The debate was resolved when we heard voices approaching from the direction we'd come from. Another group was moving through the tunnel system behind us, and they were heading directly toward the barricade we'd just discovered. Within minutes, they'd reach our position and we'd be trapped between the barricade and unknown people who might be hostile. Frank quickly identified an alternative route that would allow us to bypass the barricaded section entirely. It required climbing through a vertical shaft that connected to a parallel tunnel, but it would get us around the checkpoint without confronting whoever had built it. The climb would be challenging for some members of our group, but it was safer than waiting to see what kind of people were approaching from behind us. The vertical shaft was a maintenance access point that Frank remembered from his engineering days. It had been designed to allow workers to move between different levels of the tunnel system, but it hadn't been used in decades. The ladder was still intact, but it was rusty and potentially unstable. Each person would have to climb approximately 30 feet in complete darkness, carrying whatever supplies they could manage. Thompson went first, testing the stability of the ladder and establishing a secure position at the top of the shaft. He then helped each person climb safely, starting with the strongest individuals who could assist others if problems developed. The process was slow and exhausting, but everyone managed the climb without serious injury. Linda required assistance from Thompson and David to manage the climb with her medical equipment. Marcus helped Amy and Connor, using his teenage agility to guide them through the more difficult sections of the ascent. Patricia and Catherine worked together to get their elderly patient safely up the shaft, a process that required careful coordination and considerable physical effort. Jennifer faced the most challenging climb because she had to manage Emma while navigating the vertical shaft. Sarah and Frank worked together to create a system for passing the baby between different levels of the climb, ensuring that Emma was never more than a few feet away from adult hands that could catch her if something went wrong. The parallel tunnel at the top of the shaft was in better condition than the one we'd been traveling through, but it was also more isolated. Frank's knowledge of the system suggested that this route would take us directly to the heating plant, without passing through areas that were likely to be occupied by other groups. But it would also take longer, and we'd be traveling through sections of the tunnel system that hadn't been maintained in years. As we resumed our movement toward the observation position, Patricia's radio equipment picked up more transmissions from the group occupying the heating plant. Their conversations revealed that they were planning to leave sooner than we'd expected, possibly within the next hour. They'd received information about their alternative destination and were preparing to abandon the geothermal facility. This created both an opportunity and a pressure situation. If we could reach the observation position quickly, we might be able to move into the heating plant immediately after the current occupants left. But if we were delayed, or if other groups were monitoring the same communications, we might find ourselves in a race with multiple survivor groups to claim the facility. Frank increased our pace as much as safety allowed, but moving 18 people through unfamiliar tunnel sections required careful navigation and constant attention to potential hazards. The tunnel contained obstacles, mechanical equipment, and structural problems that could cause serious injuries if people weren't careful. About 20 minutes into our movement through the parallel tunnel, we encountered a section where water had flooded the passage to knee-deep levels. The water was flowing, which meant it was coming from somewhere and draining somewhere else, but it was cold enough to cause immediate numbness and potentially dangerous if anyone slipped and fell. David and Thompson formed a human chain to help everyone navigate the flooded section safely. They tested the depth and current of the water, identified the safest path through the obstacle, and provided physical support for people who needed assistance. The process was time-consuming, but it prevented injuries that could have compromised our entire mission. Emma handled the flooded section better than anyone expected. Jennifer kept her bundled in waterproof materials, and the baby seemed to find the movement and activity soothing rather than distressing. Linda commented that infants often adapted to stress better than adults because they didn't understand the dangers they were facing. On the far side of the flooded section, we reached a junction where Frank had to make a critical navigation decision. 2 tunnels led in the general direction of the heating plant, but they took different routes and would bring us to the facility from different angles. One route was shorter, but would require passing through an area that Frank remembered as being structurally questionable. The other route was longer but safer. Patricia's radio picked up another transmission that made the decision for us. The group in the heating plant was beginning their departure preparations immediately. They'd received urgent information about their alternative destination and were accelerating their timeline. We had perhaps 30 minutes to reach the observation position before they left the facility. Frank chose the shorter, riskier route. We moved as quickly as safety allowed through tunnel sections that showed clear signs of age and deterioration. The walls had cracks that suggested structural instability, and there was debris on the floor that indicated occasional small collapses. But the route was direct, and it would get us to the observation position before the heating plant was abandoned. The final approach to our destination required absolute silence. We were close enough to the heating plant that voices would carry, and we needed to remain undetected while the current occupants completed their departure. Frank directed us to a maintenance chamber that provided concealment and a clear view of the heating plant's main entrance. From our observation position, we could see the geothermal facility for the first time. It was larger than I'd expected, a substantial building that clearly had the capacity to shelter a significant number of people. More importantly, it showed signs of active operation. Steam was visible from several vents. Lights were functioning in some sections, and the mechanical systems appeared to be running normally. The current occupants were indeed preparing to leave. We watched as they loaded supplies into vehicles that they'd somehow gotten into the underground facility. They moved with efficiency that suggested extensive planning and preparation. These weren't desperate survivors fleeing randomly from the crisis. They were organized people executing a deliberate strategy. Patricia used her radio equipment to monitor their communications during the departure process. Their conversations revealed that they'd identified a military installation outside the city that was accepting civilian refugees with valuable skills. As city employees and technical specialists, they qualified for admission to the facility and believed it offered better long-term security than the heating plant. Thompson studied their departure procedures and noted that they were leaving the heating plant completely unguarded. They weren't positioning anyone to monitor the facility or prevent other groups from occupying it after they left. This suggested either that they didn't consider the plant valuable enough to defend, or that they were confident no one else knew about its location. As the last vehicle left the heating plant, we waited in our observation position to make sure they were really gone and to watch for other groups that might be planning to move into the facility. The radio chatter suggested that multiple survivor groups were aware of the plant's location, and we expected competition for occupancy. Sure enough, within 10 minutes of the departure, we observed another group approaching the heating plant from a different direction. This group consisted of approximately 8 people, and they moved with caution that suggested they were expecting either conflict or the possibility that the facility was still occupied. Sarah made the tactical decision that we needed to establish our presence in the heating plant before this other group could claim it. We had 18 people compared to their 8, and we included medical professionals who could provide valuable services to any survivor community. Our best strategy was to occupy the facility first and then negotiate from a position of strength. Frank led us out of the observation position and toward the heating plant's main entrance. Our approach was designed to be visible to the other group, demonstrating our presence and our numbers while avoiding actions that might be interpreted as aggressive. We wanted to establish occupancy without triggering immediate conflict. The other group stopped their approach when they saw us moving toward the facility. For several tense minutes, both groups remained in position, assessing each other and trying to determine whether cooperation or conflict was more likely. The distance between us was too great for normal conversation, but close enough that weapons would be effective if the situation deteriorated. Patricia made the decision to attempt communication. She used her radio equipment to broadcast on emergency frequencies, identifying our group and inviting discussion about sharing the heating plant. Her medical credentials and professional demeanor came through clearly in her radio voice, which helped establish our legitimacy as a survival group rather than a threat. The response came back within minutes. The other group's leader identified himself as Captain Michael Rodriguez, a retired Detroit police officer who was leading a group of city residents seeking shelter. His group included a mix of families and individuals who'd been coordinating their survival efforts since the crisis began. Captain Rodriguez's radio voice carried the authority and professionalism that came from years of law enforcement experience. He understood tactical situations, he knew how to assess threats and opportunities quickly, and he recognized that conflict over the heating plant would probably result in casualties that none of us could afford. The negotiation that followed established the foundation for everything that came after. Instead of fighting over the heating plant, both groups agreed to share the facility and coordinate our survival efforts. We had medical expertise, engineering, knowledge, and organizational skills. Rodriguez's group had security experience, local knowledge, and established communication networks with other survivor groups. But as we approached the heating plant together, preparing to enter the facility that would become our new home, we had no idea that the real challenges were just beginning. The problems we'd face inside that building would make everything we'd experienced in the tunnels seem simple by comparison, and the discovery we'd make about what was happening in other cities would change our understanding of the entire crisis. The heating plant wasn't just a shelter. It was going to become the center of a survivor community that would have to deal with resource management, leadership conflicts, and threats from other groups that would make our underground journey look like the easy part of our survival story. The heating plant exceeded every expectation we'd had about what we might find. The facility was massive, with multiple levels and sections that could easily accommodate 50 or 60 people if properly organized. The geothermal systems were functioning perfectly, maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout the building, despite the freezing conditions outside. Steam pipes provided consistent heat distribution, and the mechanical systems operated automatically, requiring minimal human intervention to maintain optimal conditions. Captain Rodriguez's group brought valuable assets to our combined survivor community. Besides his law enforcement experience, his team included a former Detroit Fire Department paramedic named Lisa Chen, an electrical engineer named Thomas Wright, and several people with construction and maintenance skills that would be crucial for long-term occupation of the facility. They'd also established radio contact with at least 6 other survivor groups throughout the Detroit area, creating a communication network that could provide early warning about threats and opportunities for trade or cooperation. Patricia immediately established a medical station in one of the plant's administrative offices, using supplies from both groups to create a treatment area that could handle everything from minor injuries to serious medical emergencies. Her team began assessing everyone's health status, treating the hypothermia cases that had developed during our tunnel journey, and establishing protocols for maintaining sanitation and preventing disease in our crowded living situation. Frank worked with Thomas Wright to understand the heating plant's mechanical systems and develop maintenance procedures that would keep the facility operational indefinitely. The geothermal systems were robust and self-sustaining, but they required periodic monitoring and adjustment to prevent problems that could compromise our heat source. Frank's city engineering experience combined with Wright's electrical knowledge created a technical team capable of managing complex infrastructure. Sarah and Lisa Chen collaborated on organizing living spaces and establishing community rules that would prevent conflicts and ensure fair distribution of resources. With 26 people now occupying the facility, we needed clear systems for everything from sleeping arrangements to food preparation to waste management. The administrative structure we created in those first few hours would determine whether our survivor community thrived or collapsed into chaos. But even as we were settling into what felt like genuine safety for the first time since the crisis began, the radio communications we were monitoring revealed disturbing information about the broader situation. Captain Rodriguez's network provided access to emergency service frequencies, government communications, and reports from other survivor groups that painted a picture of widespread catastrophe extending far beyond Detroit. The volcanic winter triggered by the Yellowstone eruption was affecting the entire continent. Cities throughout North America were experiencing similar infrastructure failures, social breakdown, and desperate survival situations. Government emergency responses were overwhelmed or completely absent in many areas. Military units were being deployed to major population centers, but rural areas and smaller cities were largely on their own. More concerning were reports about organized groups that were using the crisis to seize control of resources and territory. These weren't desperate survivors trying to stay alive. They were people who saw the collapse of normal authority as an opportunity to establish their own power structures through violence and intimidation. Radio chatter indicated that several such groups were operating in the Detroit metropolitan area. Lisa Chen had been monitoring emergency medical frequencies and reported that hospitals throughout the region were either closed or operating under siege conditions. Medical supplies were running critically low, power failures had compromised most treatment capabilities, and healthcare workers were either fleeing or barricading themselves inside facilities with remaining resources. The medical infrastructure that civilization depended on was collapsing as completely as the electrical grid. Thomas Wright's monitoring of utility company communications revealed the scope of the power grid failure. The rapid temperature drop had caused cascading failures throughout the electrical distribution system. Repair efforts were hampered by continued cold weather, lack of replacement parts, and dangerous conditions that prevented repair crews from working safely. Restoration of normal electrical service would take months or years, assuming it was possible at all. Captain Rodriguez's law enforcement contacts provided perhaps the most disturbing information. Police departments throughout the region were either disbanded or operating with skeleton crews that couldn't maintain public order. Emergency services were focused entirely on protecting government facilities and critical infrastructure. Civilian protection was essentially non-existent, and people were expected to provide their own security against the increasing violence that accompanied social breakdown. The communication equipment also picked up transmissions from survivor groups that were planning coordinated raids against facilities like ours. Groups that had been unable to find adequate shelter were identifying locations where other survivors had established successful communities, and they were organizing attacks designed to seize those resources. Our heating plant was exactly the kind of target that would attract hostile attention. Marcus had been helping monitor radio frequencies, and his teenage familiarity with communication technology allowed him to identify patterns in the transmissions that adults might miss. He noted that several groups were using coded language and coordinated timing that suggested military or paramilitary organization. These weren't random collections of desperate people. They were disciplined units with leadership, equipment, and tactical capabilities that could overwhelm civilian survivor groups. David's street experience led him to reach similar conclusions through different reasoning. The organized groups, operating in the area, were displaying behavioral patterns that reminded him of the gang structures he'd encountered during his years in Detroit. They had hierarchical leadership, territorial control objectives, and resource acquisition strategies that prioritized taking from others rather than developing their own capabilities. Jennifer was focused on Emma's immediate needs, but she was also thinking about longer-term security for her infant daughter. The radio communications made it clear that our heating plant community would eventually face threats that could endanger everyone, including children who had no ability to defend themselves or escape from dangerous situations. Amy and Connor were adapting to our new living situation with resilience that continued to impress the adults around them. These teenagers had been through trauma that would affect them permanently, but they were contributing to community organization and helping with tasks that kept everyone's spirits up during a period of extreme stress and uncertainty. Linda and Catherine Mills were working together to establish medical protocols that could maintain everyone's health in crowded conditions with limited resources. They were particularly concerned about preventing infectious diseases that could spread rapidly through our community, and they were developing sanitation procedures that would protect against contamination of our food and water supplies. Robert had been using his teaching experience to help establish educational activities for the younger community members. Even in survival situations, maintaining normal routines and continuing learning activities helped people cope with stress and maintain hope for the future. His efforts were creating stability that benefited everyone's mental health. The elderly patient from Patricia's hospital group, a man named Walter Henderson, was recovering well in the warm environment. But his condition reminded everyone that medical emergencies could occur at any time. Without access to hospitals, advanced medical equipment, or pharmaceutical supplies, our community would have to be prepared to handle serious health problems using only the resources and skills available. Within our group, Officer Thompson was working with Captain Rodriguez to develop security procedures that could protect our facility against the kind of organized threats we were hearing about on the radio. They were identifying defensive positions, creating patrol schedules, and establishing protocols for responding to different types of attacks. Their law enforcement experience was invaluable for protecting a civilian community against hostile groups. Frank and Thomas Wright made a discovery that changed our understanding of our strategic situation entirely. While exploring the heating plant's lower levels, they found that the facility was connected to Detroit's municipal water system through pipes that were still functional. We had access to clean, pressurized water that didn't depend on electrical pumps or surface infrastructure. This was an enormous advantage that most other survivor groups wouldn't have. The water system connection also revealed that the heating plant had been designed as a critical infrastructure facility that could operate independently during emergencies. The geothermal systems, the water access, and the facility's robust construction made it one of the most secure locations in the entire Detroit area. We'd found genuine long-term shelter that could support our community indefinitely. But the same radio communications that revealed our advantages also indicated that information about the heating plant was spreading among other survivor groups. References to geothermal facilities, municipal water access, and steam heating systems were appearing in transmissions from multiple groups. Our location was becoming known, and that knowledge would inevitably attract attention from people who wanted what we had. Patricia's medical team made another important discovery while treating community members for various minor ailments. Several people were showing early signs of respiratory problems that might be related to air quality issues caused by the volcanic ash. The symptoms were mild so far, but they suggested that the atmospheric contamination could cause long-term health problems that would require ongoing medical attention. Sarah's organizational efforts revealed both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of our community structure. We had an impressive range of skills and knowledge among our 26 members, but we also had significant gaps in critical areas. We lacked agricultural knowledge that would be necessary for long-term food production. We had limited experience with weapons or combat that would be essential if we faced organized attacks. We needed expertise in areas that none of our current members could provide. The radio network provided a potential solution to our skill gaps through communication with other survivor groups. Several communities had members with agricultural, military, or technical backgrounds that could complement our capabilities. The possibility of forming alliances or trading arrangements could address our weaknesses while providing valuable services to other groups. Captain Rodriguez proposed establishing regular communication with other survivor communities to share information, coordinate mutual defense, and develop trade relationships. His law enforcement experience had taught him that isolated communities were vulnerable to attacks that coordinated groups could resist more effectively. Building alliances would improve everyone's chances of long-term survival, but the same communication network that revealed opportunities for cooperation also provided intelligence about threats that were growing more dangerous every day. The organized groups that were raiding survivor communities were becoming larger, better equipped, and more aggressive. They were learning from their attacks, adapting their tactics, and targeting facilities with resources that could support extended operations. Lisa Chen's monitoring of emergency medical frequencies picked up disturbing reports about violence that was escalating throughout the region. The raids weren't just about acquiring resources. They were becoming increasingly brutal, with attacking groups killing community members who resisted and enslaving those who survived. The civilized rules that normally governed conflict were breaking down completely. Thomas Wright's technical analysis of our facility's capabilities led him to conclude that while the heating plant could support our current community indefinitely, it couldn't be easily expanded to accommodate additional people. The geothermal systems, water access, and living space were adequate for perhaps 30 people, but beyond that capacity, we'd face resource constraints that could compromise everyone's survival. This created a strategic dilemma that would define our community's future. We could remain a small, secure group that could survive indefinitely in our current facility, or we could attempt to grow into a larger community that could better defend against organized attacks but would require additional resources and territory that we'd have to acquire somehow. The decision was complicated by the fact that other people were already seeking admission to our community. Radio communications included requests from small groups and individuals who'd heard about our successful shelter and were asking for permission to join us. Each request represented both an opportunity to add valuable skills to our community and a risk that we'd exceed our facility's carrying capacity. Frank's engineering analysis suggested that we could modify the heating plant to support additional people, but the modifications would require materials and expertise that we'd have to obtain from outside sources. Expanding our capabilities would mean venturing out of our secure facility and potentially exposing ourselves to the dangers that other communities were facing. The radio communications that had initially seemed like such an advantage were becoming a source of constant stress and difficult decisions. Every transmission brought new information about threats, opportunities, and situations that required our community to make choices about its future direction and survival strategy. As we settled into our second night in the heating plant, listening to radio reports about violence and chaos spreading throughout the region, we realized that finding shelter had only been the first step in our survival journey. The real challenges were just beginning, and the decisions we made in the coming days would determine whether our community thrived or became another casualty of the collapse that was consuming the world we'd once known. By our third day in the heating plant, the radio communications had revealed the true scope of what we were facing. This wasn't just a regional disaster that would be resolved when government agencies restored order. The volcanic winter was causing global climate disruption that would last for months or possibly years. Governments were collapsing, military units were fragmenting, and survivor communities were emerging as the primary form of social organization in a world where traditional authority structures no longer existed. Captain Rodriguez's communication network had expanded to include contact with survivor groups as far away as Chicago, Cleveland, and Toronto. The reports were consistently grim. Every major city was experiencing similar patterns of infrastructure failure, social breakdown, and violent competition for dwindling resources. The few functioning government facilities were focused entirely on protecting political and military leadership, abandoning civilian populations to fend for themselves. Patricia's medical team had treated radio communications as a source of epidemiological intelligence, tracking reports of disease outbreaks that were spreading through survivor communities throughout the region. Without functioning healthcare systems, preventable illnesses were becoming fatal, and infectious diseases were spreading rapidly through crowded shelters. Our community's medical capabilities represented a critical advantage that other groups would want to access or acquire. Thomas Wright had been monitoring technical communications from utility companies, transportation networks, and industrial facilities, painting a picture of systematic infrastructure collapse that extended far beyond electrical power systems. Fuel distribution networks had failed. Transportation systems were inoperable, and manufacturing facilities were either destroyed or abandoned. The complex supply chains that modern civilization depended on were completely broken. Frank's engineering analysis of our situation led him to conclude that the heating plant represented more than just temporary shelter. With its geothermal energy, municipal water access, and robust construction, our facility could serve as the foundation for a permanent settlement that might outlast the crisis and become the nucleus for rebuilding civilization in our area. But that possibility also made us a target for the organized groups that were systematically conquering territory throughout the region. Radio intelligence indicated that these groups weren't just raiding for supplies. They were establishing permanent control over critical infrastructure, enslaving populations with valuable skills, and building power structures that could dominate large areas for the indefinite future. Sarah's organizational efforts had created community structures that were working well for our current 26 members, but she was also planning for the challenges we'd face as our situation evolved. Leadership decisions that seemed simple with a small group would become complex as we grew. Resource allocation that worked fine with current numbers would become contentious if supplies became scarce. Conflict resolution procedures that relied on personal relationships would need formal structures as our community expanded. Lisa Chen's monitoring of emergency medical frequencies had identified specific hostile groups that represented immediate threats to communities like ours. A paramilitary organization calling itself the Detroit Recovery Authority was systematically attacking survivor settlements, killing anyone who resisted, and forcing survivors to work in labor camps that supported their operations. Intelligence suggested they had military-grade equipment, trained personnel, and strategic objectives that included controlling all critical infrastructure in the metropolitan area. Officer Thompson and Captain Rodriguez had developed defensive preparations based on their assessment of the threats we were likely to face. They'd identified firing positions, established patrol procedures, and created early warning systems that could provide advance notice if hostile groups approached our facility. But they were also realistic about our limitations. Our community included elderly people, teenagers, and an infant who couldn't contribute to combat operations, and most of our members had no experience with weapons or tactical situations. David's street experience led him to focus on intelligence gathering and early warning capabilities, rather than direct confrontation with hostile groups. He understood that survival often depended more on avoiding dangerous situations than on winning fights. His knowledge of Detroit's geography and social dynamics could help us identify safe routes, reliable sources of information, and potential allies among other survivor groups. Marcus had become our primary radio operator, using his familiarity with communication technology to monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously and maintain contact with allied communities throughout the region. His work revealed patterns in hostile group activities that suggested coordinated operations extending across multiple states. The organized attacks weren't random or opportunistic. They were part of systematic campaigns to establish territorial control over large areas. Jennifer was adapting to the reality that Emma would grow up in a world fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the crisis. Her focus on immediate childcare needs was expanding to include longer-term concerns about education, socialization, and safety in a community that might face constant threats from hostile groups. The decisions our community made about security and expansion would directly affect her daughter's future. Amy and Connor were developing skills and knowledge that would make them valuable community members as they matured. Their adaptability and resilience were assets that would become increasingly important as our situation evolved. But they were also experiencing trauma that would affect their psychological development, and their well-being represented a responsibility that our community couldn't ignore even when facing immediate survival threats. Linda and Catherine Mills had established medical protocols that were preventing disease outbreaks and maintaining community health. But they were also preparing for medical emergencies that could occur without warning. Their pharmaceutical supplies were limited, their equipment was basic, and they lacked access to specialized treatments that serious injuries or illnesses might require. The medical capabilities that had initially seemed adequate were becoming insufficient as they considered longer-term healthcare needs. Robert's educational activities were maintaining community morale and providing structure for daily life, but he was also thinking about preserving knowledge and skills that would be essential for rebuilding civilization. His teaching experience included understanding of how communities maintained cultural continuity during periods of crisis, and he was developing programs that could preserve important information even if our current generation didn't survive. Walter Henderson's recovery from his pneumonia had been successful, but his condition reminded everyone that age-related health problems would become increasingly serious without access to advanced medical care. Our community included several people over 60 whose survival would depend on maintaining the warm, stable environment that our heating plant provided. The radio network that had initially provided valuable intelligence was also becoming a source of psychological stress for community members who were constantly exposed to reports of violence, failure, and death from throughout the region. Captain Rodriguez and Sarah had established protocols limiting access to communications that weren't directly relevant to our community's security, but the reality of our situation was impossible to ignore completely. Frank and Thomas Wright had completed their technical assessment of the heating plant's expansion possibilities, concluding that we could modify the facility to support approximately 40 people if we acquired additional materials and equipment. The modifications would require venturing outside our secure perimeter to obtain supplies from abandoned buildings, which would expose work parties to attacks from hostile groups operating in the area. Patricia's medical team had identified health problems that were likely to become more serious as the crisis continued. Several community members were showing signs of vitamin deficiencies that would require dietary supplements or access to fresh foods that weren't available in our current location. The respiratory problems caused by volcanic ash exposure were worsening in some cases, requiring treatments that our medical supplies couldn't provide indefinitely. The combination of technical limitations, medical needs, and security threats was forcing our community toward decisions that would define our future survival strategy. We could remain in our current facility and accept the constraints that imposed on our growth and capabilities. We could attempt to expand our operations to acquire additional resources and territory, or we could form alliances with other communities that would provide mutual support and shared resources. Captain Rodriguez received a radio transmission that changed our strategic situation entirely. A coalition of survivor communities in the northern suburbs was organizing coordinated defense against the Detroit Recovery Authority. and other hostile groups operating in the region. They were requesting participation from communities with medical capabilities, technical expertise, and strategic locations that could contribute to collective security operations. The coalition proposal offered our community access to resources, skills, and protection that we couldn't provide for ourselves. Member communities would share intelligence, coordinate mutual defense, and provide assistance during emergencies that exceeded individual community capabilities. The medical services that Patricia's team could provide would be valuable to other communities that lacked healthcare capabilities. But joining the coalition would also require our community to participate in military operations against hostile groups, provide resources to support collective defense efforts, and accept strategic decisions made by coalition leadership that might conflict with our community's immediate interests. We'd be trading independence for security and autonomy for access to larger resource networks. Sarah organized community meetings to discuss the coalition proposal and other strategic options facing our community. The discussions revealed fundamental disagreements about our future direction that reflected different priorities, risk assessments, and values among community members. Some people prioritized immediate safety and were willing to accept constraints that provided security. Others valued independence and preferred to face risks rather than accept external control. Patricia supported joining the coalition because it would provide access to medical supplies, equipment, and expertise that could improve healthcare capabilities for everyone. Her professional experience had taught her that medical emergencies required resources that individual communities couldn't maintain independently, and cooperation with other healthcare providers was essential for maintaining adequate treatment capabilities. Thomas Wright was concerned about the technical commitments that coalition membership might require. Contributing our engineering and electrical expertise to collective projects could compromise our ability to maintain and improve our own facility. He was also worried about sharing information about our capabilities that could make us targets if the coalition collapsed or if member communities turned hostile. Captain Rodriguez and Officer Thompson supported coalition membership because it would provide intelligence, coordination, and mutual defense capabilities that our community couldn't develop independently. Their law enforcement experience had taught them that isolated communities were vulnerable to attacks that coordinated groups could resist effectively. Military cooperation was essential for surviving the organized threats operating in the region. Frank was conflicted about the coalition proposal because it represented both opportunities and risks that were difficult to assess accurately. Coalition membership could provide access to resources and expertise that would enable significant improvements to our facility and capabilities. But it could also involve our community in conflicts and obligations that might compromise our security or independence. David was skeptical about coalition arrangements because his street experience had taught him that formal alliances often concealed power relationships that favored stronger partners at the expense of weaker ones. He was concerned that our community's valuable assets would make us attractive targets for exploitation by coalition partners who had different priorities and less ethical standards. The debate was interrupted by radio communications indicating that hostile groups were accelerating their operations throughout the region. The Detroit Recovery Authority had begun a systematic campaign to seize control of all critical infrastructure facilities, and intelligence suggested they were specifically targeting communities with medical capabilities, technical expertise, and strategic locations like ours. Marcus reported that radio chatter included specific references to geothermal facilities, municipal water access, and medical resources that clearly described our heating plant community. Our location was known to hostile groups, and attacks against our facility were being planned and coordinated through communications that our radio equipment was intercepting. Lisa Chen's monitoring of emergency medical frequencies revealed that several coalition member communities had already been attacked by the Detroit Recovery Authority, with casualties that included healthcare workers who'd been specifically targeted for execution. The hostile groups weren't just seizing resources, they were systematically eliminating people with skills that could enable resistance or community independence. The intelligence about planned attacks against our community eliminated the luxury of extended debate about coalition membership. We needed allies, resources, and coordinated defense capabilities immediately. Or we'd face the same fate as communities that had tried to maintain independence against superior numbers and firepower. Captain Rodriguez established emergency communication with coalition leadership, requesting immediate assistance and offering our communities participation in collective defense operations. The response confirmed that attacks against multiple coalition communities were planned for the following day, including a major assault against our heating plant that would involve overwhelming force designed to seize our facility intact. Patricia began preparing her medical team for combat casualties, organizing supplies and equipment that could provide emergency treatment for wounded community members and coalition fighters. Her hospital experience had included treating victims of violence, but the scale of casualties that coordinated military attacks could produce would challenge even experienced medical professionals. Thomas Wright and Frank worked together to implement defensive modifications to our heating plant facility, using their engineering knowledge to create barriers, observation positions, and protected areas that could provide advantages during combat operations. The modifications were improvised and limited by available materials, but they represented significant improvements to our defensive capabilities. Sarah organized non-combatant community members for support roles that would be essential during combat operations. Amy and Connor would assist with medical operations, providing basic care that would free up trained medical personnel for serious cases. Robert and Linda would manage communications and logistics, ensuring that defensive operations had adequate coordination and supply support. Jennifer and Emma would be evacuated to the most secure area of the facility, along with Walter Henderson and other community members who couldn't contribute to combat operations. Their safety was a primary concern that would influence tactical decisions about defending different areas of the heating plant complex. Officer Thompson and Captain Rodriguez established final defensive positions and reviewed emergency procedures with all community members. Everyone needed to understand their roles during combat operations, evacuation routes if defensive positions were overrun, and rally points where survivors could regroup if the facility was lost. The radio communications that had provided valuable intelligence throughout our stay at the heating plant now carried final coordinating messages between coalition communities preparing for the largest military operation any of us had experienced. Multiple survivor communities were facing coordinated attacks by hostile groups that had superior numbers, equipment, and training. As night fell on our third day in the heating plant, we knew that morning would bring violence that would determine whether our community survived or joined. The growing list of settlements that had been destroyed by organized groups seeking to control the New World, emerging from civilization's collapse. The 72 hours since the world had frozen had taught us that survival required more than finding shelter and staying warm. It required building communities that could defend themselves, forming alliances that could resist organized threats, and making decisions that balanced immediate safety against longer-term strategic objectives. But the radio transmissions we were monitoring as we prepared for battle contained information about what was happening in other cities, other countries, and other continents that would force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the scope of the crisis we were facing. The attacks we'd face tomorrow were just the beginning of a much larger conflict that would determine what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of the civilization that had died when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single morning and changed everything forever. If you're out there listening to this, if you're trying to survive what's coming next, remember this. It's not the cold that kills you in an apocalypse. It's forgetting that you're still human. And sometimes being human means making the hard choices that keep everyone else alive.